Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
If you want to grow the reach, revenue, and impact of your learning business, you're in the right place. I'm Celisa Steele.
I'm Jeff Cobb, and this is the Leading Learning Podcast.
Learning isn't just content. It's a neurobiological process. But according to our guest, the way most workplace learning is designed doesn't recognize that reality.
Our guest in this episode, number 480, is Dr. Tessa Forshaw, cognitive scientist and faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she studies how people work, learn, and create in the flow of their work.
In our conversation, Tessa walks through 5 principles grounded in science, from the fact that learning is biological and social to the importance of situated learning, productive effort, and transfer. And she explains what each principle means for how learning experiences should be designed.
You and Tessa also explore why learning businesses may have some surprising advantages when it comes to applying these principles and where to focus if you want your programs to make a real difference in how learners perform on the job.
Yes, and Tessa makes a strong case for metacognition as the single most impactful thing you can build into any learning program to improve retention, durability, and transfer.
If you design, deliver, or lead learning experiences and you want to better align what you do with what the science actually tells us about how adults learn, then this conversation with Dr. Tessa Forshaw is for you.
You're the faculty chair of the Workforce and Workplace Concentration at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. You're also directing the Workforce Learning and Innovation Initiative. So maybe tell us a little bit about that initiative and your role with it.
Education schools have spent decades studying how people learn, and there's an incredible amount of expertise at HGSE amongst my colleagues who studied education and learning for such a long time, but rarely has that expertise being pointed at workforce learning. And it's not like you turn 18 and don't continue into a university and then magically your brain learns differently and all the principles change. That's not true. And so this initiative is really focused on how do we make sure that we're extending and applying all the science that we know about how people learn that is deeply embedded in HGSE into this very high priority population. So there are 3 streams associated with the program. The first is this idea of preparing, so a concentration in the master's program in workforce and workplace learning. So it's like a major for students in the master's program. And it's really about how do we prepare the next generation of workforce learning leaders. The second component is what we're calling equip, and that's focused on professional certificates in workforce and workplace learning. And so we recently did the first cohort of that earlier in the year. We have another one coming up in July. And that's, the first sort of type of workforce learning focus certificate at HGSE. So that's very exciting. And then the third component of the initiative is what we call Discover. And that's really about applied research partnerships with organizations where we partner with them to do typically design-based research in real organizations, in real contexts, focused around real problems of practice. We apply research methodologies to really uncover what's working, what's not, and then share that with the field.
So I've read that you've asserted that workforce learning still doesn't really match what we know about how people learn. So I would love to hear what you see as some of the biggest mismatches between that science of learning and what we know, and then the way that adult workers are commonly taught, or the way we design learning for those adult workers.
I love that that's what you've gleaned from my work. I definitely think that when I talk to a lot of learning leaders, learning is often discussed as content delivery. So they will talk about learning as the content that is being created or the event that is being held. But I think it's really important that we remember that learning isn't content. Learning is a neurobiological process, and that process is influenced by chemicals in our brain and hormones in our body that are shaped by the environment and the context that we sit within. And so when we sort of understand learning in that lens, it both opens up where learning can happen and what it looks like, but it also gives L&D, or it puts the responsibility of in establishing the conditions that create and foster those positive neurochemicals and hormones to incite learning and sort of alleviate the ones that don't. And it puts that responsibility on L&D teams or on organizations providing learning experiences in a way that it hasn't typically been considered before.
You were saying before we got started that one of the things that you talk about in the certificate are five principles for sort of the future of workplace learning. So maybe could you just sort of outline and briefly explain those five principles?
Yes, I absolutely can. So the five principles that we talk about start with this idea of learning is biological. So we understand that sort of behavior change comes from changes in the mind, which comes from changes in the brain, which comes from changes in the cell. I'm sure you're familiar with those like games that were really popular about 10 years ago where they're all like neuroplasticity. And so there's a lot of fake going on there, but there is a seed of truth or a grain of truth, and that is that neuroplasticity is the foundation of learning. The ability for us to create a new neural pathway between two neurons is the foundation of all learning. So when we understand that the cell influences the brain, which influences the mind, which influences behavior, that helps us think about how we can create learning in organizations, especially because so many workplaces are full of things that make that biological process harder. They're full of cortisol, they're full of cognitive overload, they're full of constant context switching, they're full of being triggered and having your amygdala hijacked when stress takes over and your brain doesn't operate at its peak performance anymore. And so I think when we understand learning as biological, we can also start to understand that learning at work is actually very rarely about effort or attention, and it's much more about the conditions in our bodies and our environments that are sort of blocking this cellular change from happening. So that's sort of one component. The next principle is that learning is social. And so we know from decades of research on expertise development and the nature of learning that people become experts by being around people who are further along in that area of expertise. So having people more experienced others share mental models, expose their reasoning to you, and really, I think, foster that sort of traditional romantic idea of apprenticeship that we have from hundreds of years ago. So learning is very social and it happens in relationships with others. The third principle is that learning is situated. And so this is really focused on the idea that pulling people out of work to go and learn is a really tough design choice because that the brain encodes skills along with the context in which they are learned in. So a lot of people don't realize that our environments actually play a huge role in the retrieval of learning because we associate different knowledge and skills practices to the physical environment in which we learn them. And so then when we're in those environments, they can help us cue it forward. And so if we learn something in an abstracted classroom on a beautiful L&D center that's sort of off as a campus, and then we're supposed to go back and apply it on a factory floor, that's going to be very hard because the environment isn't cueing that knowledge that we've learned to be brought forward. And those retrieval pathways aren't yet strong because it's new knowledge. The fourth principle is that learning takes effort. So we talked a little bit about learning being a biological process and that there being the creation of a pathway between two neurons. So if you could imagine for me like a bank of sand and you have a stick at either end and you want to create a pathway between the two of them that stays, you have to like really dig into the stand and put some effort in there. That's the same in your mind. You actually need effort to forge that pathway. So learning takes effort. So being easy and just like super fun isn't necessarily what we're going for. We're going for experiences that provide opportunities for effort. And then finally, that learning has to transfer so that the point of learning is that it can be applied in future contexts. And so that means that when we're, especially today, where those future contexts are often ambiguous and we don't know how they're going to change, that means that when we think about learning, we have to think about designing opportunities to expansively frame all of the different ways things could be applied. And again, that's part of helping that sort of encoding it in a way that's much easier for us to retrieve at our moment of need. So they're the 5 principles.
Running a learning business today requires attention to growing reach, generating revenue, and demonstrating real impact, all while navigating constant change and fierce competition for learners' time and money.
To help, we've curated a collection of free resources for learning business professionals. You'll find frameworks, briefings, and reports, webinars, and tools focused on strategy, portfolio design, pricing, marketing, and more, all created specifically for organizations that sell continuing education and professional development.
If you care about building a stronger, more sustainable learning business, visit leadinglearning.com/free resources.
That's leadinglearning.com/free resources for practical tools and strategic insight to help you grow your reach, revenue, and impact.
As I've shared with you, most of our listeners work in what we call learning businesses. And so they are all about trying to support those learners and they want to help them improve on the job, at work, as professionals, but they don't tend to have that sort of direct access to their learners on the job. So I'm just wondering how these principles might inform how folks like that, who have a little bit of a, sort of a bit of a distance between them and some of their learners in a way, or at least their learners' workplaces, how might those principles inform how they think about building courses, creating programs, other learning experiences? Are some of those principles more or less relevant when thinking about kind of learning businesses rather than corporate L&D?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in the first version of a program, we had some people from learning businesses, as you described them. And in the discussions that I've had with each of our participants since, I think one of the things that came up was particularly this first one of learning being biological. When you have a separated environment and that is just the reality of your business, that's actually a huge win for sort of creating and controlling the culture of the environment in a way that can support the biology. So, for example, you have the opportunity to pace the experience in such a way that assumes your learners are coming in tired and distracted. You have the opportunity to alleviate some of that time pressure, to provide them with space, to make sure that there's food available to them, because if you're hungry, your body releases hunger hormones and hunger hormones shut down neuroplasticity. So you have these sort of opportunities to help really lean into the design of the biological requirements and control those in a way that's like very difficult in a team meeting on the go at work where the manager is trying to teach somebody to a subordinate, right? With the relationships component, I think you also have a huge opportunity to create environments of peer accountability, of bringing in experts who are not people that they might otherwise be exposed to, who they can build relationships with. So there's still a lot that you can do around the social nature of learning and make it about learning between humans and with humans. It doesn't have to be learning with the person who sits next to them, right? So I think there's a lot that can be done there. I think the situated component definitely is one of the things that comes up as a little more challenging. And so when I was chatting to this participant, what we spoke a lot about was around how do you think about providing opportunities to map to practice, or providing opportunities for them to do activities that might take it. They might have something that they take back, and you give them the instruction of do this in your work environment and notice, like, encourage them to be metacognitive and like notice what about the environment is important to this particular activity that we're learning, and then bring that back into the class and into the discussion. So it's not situated in the sense that it's like physically happening in a space that it occurs, but the situated nature of where the skills and the learning needs to be performed is inherent in the discussion and is part of the consideration, so that you're still building associations to some of those features and realities. So I think that was kind of interesting. And then the last one is like, I mean, I think effort is the same, but transfer, I think, is, I would argue that like it's actually, so transfer and learning, being situated and being needed to transfer can often be in tension with each other. Because if something is really situated, it's easier to keep forward in the moment of the moment of performance in which it was designed to be used. But that makes it really hard to disembed it and transfer it to a future context that you don't yet know. Does that make sense? So if I learn something on my job in this specific context and I'm applying it all the time because it's deeply sort of cued by the physical environment that I'm in, that can make it harder for me if my job gets disrupted and I have to take on a brand new role. It can make it much harder for me to understand how those skills could apply in that new context where they're not being automatically cued. And so I think that external learning organizations have a really big role to play in the transfer piece, because they're not as burdened by the situated, which is important as we've already discussed, but intention. And they have the opportunity to expansively frame. So what I mean by that is to help learners learn a thing and then provide them examples of all the different kinds of places and contexts that these skills like functionally would have relevance. So a great example of that is if you're teaching coding, instead of just bringing in the alumni who's the software engineer in the code that you taught, which is often what we see with coding boot camps and things like that. What about bringing in the 5 other alumni who didn't go on to do anything to do specifically with being a software engineer, but instead are using the skills that they learned in this program in really diverse ways? Like they've used the idea of logical thinking and syntax to design their own personal training business, or they've used coding to help them expand their skill set and enter into marketing automation at work, or where they've not become the exact thing, but and so as an organization who is a little bit not as proximate to where the learning is happening, that's actually a huge asset.
Well, transfer is something I did want to talk about because I do feel like it is so important. And so you gave some great examples there about, maybe, not just sort of showing how, oh, someone can maybe use this learning experience to sort of achieve maybe the more expected goal of coding boot camp, become a software coder, but also how maybe just the way you begin to think when you're going through that boot camp can apply in other situations. Do you have other things that you've learned about what really helps with adults transfer learning into those new roles, new projects, new performance situations?
Yeah, great question. I've just come off a sort of a 6-year like focus of learning jazz. That was like I went down a very deep rabbit hole. So I just want to share a little bit about my own journey with that and how it changed, how I think about transfer changed, if that's okay. So when I went into this, I really understood transfer as being you learn something and then you're able to immediately apply it. Often that learning happens in a classroom or a formal kind of environment of some kind. And then the next day or whatever, you can apply it. And that sort of view of transfer has been historically what we've had for about 100 years from very old scholars, Thorndike, and who had a theory called common elements. That if something had common elements, you could transfer it to it. And they would do these tests where you would put a student in a learning environment that was like a math class, and then the next day they could apply the principles of their learning in the math class to a novel problem in front of them. Lo and behold, this didn't work. And there's been entire books written about like transfer on trial, the elusive transfer doesn't exist, like these kinds of headings. And I think I sort of came to realize that's because we have a very narrow view of what transfer is. And we were measuring transfer as the person only being able to apply exactly what was given to them, 10 minutes before. And we were also in that scenario assuming that the thing that they were taught 10 minutes before, they were taught well, which isn't necessarily true, right? So, what I started to notice as I stepped back from transfer in this sort of view was that people are able to transfer in things to approach novel problems that aren't necessarily the thing that we just taught them. So, there was this study done by Dan Schwartz, who's the current dean of the Graduate School of Education at Stanford, about 20 years ago. And it's, I think, there's this sort of one paragraph in it that is so illustrative of this, where they were trying to teach students about bald eagles. They then got them to do a project on bald eagles. And what they noticed was that while students didn't use exactly what they were taught, they were actually drawing from parts of knowledge that they've acquired throughout their entire 13 years of schooling to solve this problem. Of course they are, right? Like, we don't have control over how somebody's neural architecture looks, about what cues forward what knowledge for them. But what we can do is make sure that we help and surface people to use what knowledge they already have, to look at them as assetful, that they already have a lot to work with, that they've learned in their life, in their professional life, in their schooling, in their personal life, and to bring that forward to approach novel tasks that they have never done before. So that's sort of how I started to change my view of transfer to be much more about how do you bring forward whatever it is you have to approach a novel task and to start to solve it. You might not get 100% of the way, but you're definitely going to have some sort of first principles, some basic knowledge or analogies from your life that you can bring forward that are relevant to get you going. And so, through that line of inquiry, we decided to do a study that looked at a place where this kind of novel role transfer happens with great frequency. And that's because sometimes when we're looking at something that's elusive, as I said, it's good to go what we call bird watching. Like, you go to the habitat where you know the bird will be to study it, rather than just like walking outside and looking up and hoping to find that bird in your sky. So that's what we did. And we studied 75 consultants in the sort of early parts of their career, where they do jobs like, in 1 year, in one person, it'll be like, I'm doing a quality assurance testing for an Oracle software implementation. Now I'm doing a due diligence assessment for a private equity takeover of an online retailer. Now I'm doing a go-to-market strategy for a knee reconstruction device. Now I'm helping with the change management plans for the leadership for the leadership office for an M&A of a company, right? Like, really different jobs. Like, to anybody outside of consulting, you'd be like, don't you need entirely different degrees to do those? Right. But one person is doing all of these. And so we looked at, like, how is it that they do them, and to a reasonably successful level. And there's no like formal training interventions in between each one either. And so what we found was that there were a series of individual practices that these consultants often demonstrated. There were a series of environmental features that were present in the two different consulting organizations that we looked at. And there were also a set of managerial practices of the new manager that they were going, that was on the novel role. And so we took all of those and then we designed interventions focused on the individual practices and the managerial practices. And ultimately, what we found over the series of design-based studies was that only the managerial practices actually had a predictive outcome on if a learner was able to successfully transfer knowledge to a novel project and novel task as measured by their managing director's evaluation of their performance and time to competency in the novel role. So, what I would take from that is first, I would caution that we're talking about elite consultants who probably went to elite universities. And so that often, I think, means that maybe some of the effect of the personal practices might have been negligible for us to detect because they were already all performing them to such a baseline, if that makes sense, just based on sort of who they are and how they got there. Whereas, like, if we intervened with the personal practices in a different context, I question I have is like, would we actually also see that as predictive? So I don't want people to take away what I'm saying as like individual practices around transfer don't matter. It's just to say that in this context, we didn't see that as being predictive. But the managers piece, I think, is something that is interesting, especially for learning businesses like you're talking about, because, and the audience here, because they don't always have control over what the manager does, right? But the manager plays a hugely outsized role in a learner's ability to transfer and apply learning on the job.
Right. That's interesting. Like you said, it's a potential challenge, but it does perhaps suggest there might be some interventions or resources that could come along with, okay, here you are as an individual coming to this course, this conference. Here are some materials you might take back and share with your manager when you get back, perhaps to sort of prime that manager to be most supportive of that learner applying and transferring knowledge.
Yes, and one very specific behavior that I think was sort of outsized in the set was the manager's role in helping them connect prior learning to the novel context. So we would notice that they would say things like, "Hey, so you know how you went to that conference and there you did that whole session on." I'm just going to make something up here, like, how to structure unstructured data to make it effective in AI models. So that's something, some of those things there could be really interesting to how we're approaching this problem. I'd love you to go away and explicitly do that mapping by helping them, by inviting them, firstly, to do that. Again, we talked about cueing. The manager is then cueing the learner to start going, oh, I have to go back and retrieve all of these things and bring them here. And now I'm going to start making connections between this thing that I'm doing and those prior things that I've learned. Remember, learning is about creating a connection between two neurons. So that is one really important practice, is as a manager taking responsibility for guiding the learner to think about how the things they learn in X context apply to the specific task that you're doing. And sometimes that also means helping them with that reasoning. So might mean having them do that thinking, bring it back, and then engage in the reasoning with them to help them get it right. Because remember, we talked about how if you transfer prior learning, sometimes you're only going to get 80% of the way there based on everything that you already know. So the manager is quite important in sort of making sure that we don't have what one of my colleagues calls overzealous transfer, where you are, overexcited transferring forward things that shouldn't apply to this novel context.
It's also making me think, too, that there's the potential for a learning business who would have, say, for example, a history of what a learner took in terms of courses or attended conferences with at least that learning business. And so there would be some potential for queuing based on, hey, you remember when you took course X, last year, think about how that might apply now in this current course. So it does seem like there's some potential. It's not the managerial role per se, but some of that queuing could still potentially happen.
Yes, absolutely. So for my own teaching practice, a lot of this work really changed how I teach myself, and had that tough moment in the mirror where I was like, oh, that's like some of this needs to change based on these findings. And one of the things that I changed to was in every class, I know that this is hard because we're all time pressed, but I actually make intentional space of 3 or 4 minutes of, okay, today we're going to be talking about creative problem solving. I teach a lot of skills that are creative and cognitive skills. So we're going to talk about creative problem solving. I want you to spend the next 3 or 4 minutes really bringing in, what do you think creative problem solving is? Where are some examples of creative problem solving? Where are some examples that you've seen problem solving that wasn't creative? How are those two things different? So, what I am doing in that moment is helping them transfer in everything that they know from, doesn't matter where it's from. Like I said, it could be they learnt creative problem solving in an improv class that they did at a mother daughter event at their kid's school. Like it doesn't matter where it comes from, right? So bring in what they know and help them start to reason through it. And so then they're starting from this place of, I already have some things that I know about what we're talking about. But the other benefit is then as we start to engage in learning over this course of this experience, they are more able to connect the new knowledge to existing knowledge, which means it's going to be more durable and easy to retrieve because the more connected it is and the more associated with existing retrieval pathways it is, the easier it is for us to recall. So that's like a massive win for the durability. And then the second piece is that if there's anything in their existing mental model that I actually want them to unlearn, I'm bringing that forward so that this new knowledge can help sort of with that reorganization. And it means that if they ever default to sort of the old way of thinking, or maybe that I needed them to unlearn, this new knowledge is also attached to it. And so they might go, oh, I need to do it this way. Oh, actually, no, I've got to do this other thing too. That's right. Right. So it's a really helpful practice that I've extrapolated.
I want to go back to the principle around sort of the role of social relationships in learning. And that can be, I guess, more formal mentorships or more informal, sort of just relationships with others who are doing similar kinds of work or thinking. I am, again, thinking about our listeners who primarily don't have access to necessarily mentors on the job for those learners, but sort of what can they do still on the social side that might sort of tap into some of those relationships and the way that they can help make sure that the learning gets to take advantage of that importance of the social role in just how we learn.
It's really a fascinating thing to me in corporate learning and learning businesses and stuff. We talk a lot about cohort and community, but sometimes we don't actually recognize that it's not just like nice and makes the environment great and good for a network, but actually these sorts of features of cohort and community make learning more durable because when we learn things in ways that is through a story that someone else tells us, that starts to engage our ability to have empathy. Empathy is actually one of the most effective neurological experiences that we can have to help us reorganize pre-existing mental models. We tend to be able to do that much more fluidly through empathy than in other ways, like without empathy. So that's one example, but there are so many. The other things are, by hearing different people's ways of speaking and things like that, we start to be able to sort of start to engage in understanding if there's a language and a discourse of the community that we're trying to be part of and to speak in their terminology. And those things sort of happen socially and informally. And it's a whole discipline of literature. And I would say it goes back like hundreds of years. Vygotsky, really believing that learning was this socio-relational process, and it's very true. So I would encourage organizations to think about community and cohorts and things like that, not just in a way of like, how do we help them network or how do we make sure that they like have a WhatsApp group to organize drinks or whatever it is, but to think about the design of those as part of learning and essential to learning. So sometimes that means needing to facilitate and model what those interactions need to look like at the beginning. It can mean giving buddies within cohorts that are around affinity, but helping them by structuring the beginning of that relationship so they get used to it and get good at it. It can also mean like simple things like providing individuals opportunities to share their mental models, even if it's not in an effort to like you're buddied up, but you're just in a classroom and everyone's sitting there to sort of say to someone, I'd love it if you could share your mental model of how you're thinking about that thing you just described. And if they do that, then other people are engaging in that's a socio-relational aspect of learning, right? So I think there's a lot that can be done, but thinking about it as as a necessary requirement for learning in and as a design principle in that way, and instead of, as I sort of said, as just like the community and cohort kind of piece is really important. And it changes what you come up with. It changes how you think about those experiences in your program and how you value them and the time you give them and the weight you give them.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I do feel like sometimes we have this, as you said, this idea of cohorts, but really what it comes down to is it's this group of people who happen to be going through the class at the same time. But if you leave it only at that, then it's really not doing the work of the cohort. So thinking about how to more intentionally create those meaningful exchanges so that, one peer can hear from another how they're thinking about a particular situation or topic, I think is incredibly powerful. And I just sort of underline what you're saying about making time for that and making sure that it's part of the design. So I'm thinking about listeners who maybe, really are looking to improve their workforce relevant offerings. So they have these, courses where they really are trying to make their learners able to do better on the job in the profession. So if you're thinking about what they might be able to do in the short term to kind of better align their programs with what you know about how adults actually learn at work, what might be a suggestion that you might encourage them to think about or try out and test?
So I definitely think I would be encouraging them to make time in their offerings for learners to be metacognitive. I think often we expect learners to do that separately, or we know it's nice, but we try to sort of make them do it at the same time as being cognitive. Like, so you can't learn something and have cognitive attention to the thing you're learning and be metacognitive about it at the same time. It's just not possible. And so, really making intentional moments for learners to think about things like, right, as you enter this experience, like what are strategies that you find really helpful to your learning and your attention? What do you need to do right now to adjust your environment to make sure that you'll like show up in a way that meets your goal for this session? Even things like, as you're in the middle of the learning environment, inviting learners to surface things that are very clear to them and feel very crystallized, but stuff that still feels very uncertain and that they don't feel like they have a complete understanding of yet, and pausing in the middle to help them do that and help them come up with strategies for how they might adjust how they're thinking, or etc. If they're holding on to something really strongly, which just happens a lot, I think with adult learners, we have very deeply automated or routinized perspectives sometimes, and helping them notice when that's as a result of a bias and that might be inhibiting them to learn. So what I mean by bias, like a cognitive bias. So for example, we as humans succumb to dozens and dozens of cognitive biases every day and for good reason. They help us use less metabolic energy. So there's a really good reason for them. We don't want them to go away, but it's really good to notice them. So one might be like, all right, you seem to be, are you resisting the new principles that we're teaching right now? And is that coming from a place of genuine critical thinking and skepticism, or is that coming from a place of status quo bias? And is that because right now you're really resistant to this because you feel like the way it's done, the way it's always been done, feels comfortable, it feels easier, it feels like it would take less effort. And that's inhibiting, your ability to engage with or learn what we're discussing right now. So inviting sort of these conversations into learning experiences is essential because, what the data on metacognition is unambiguous is the word I'm going to use, in that it results in better performance, it results in better durability, it results in better transfer of the skills. Like it's the single thing that I would do if I was trying to improve my programming and improve the learner's ability to apply what they're learning in my context to work.
We always love to ask folks who come on the Leading Learning podcast about their approach to their own ongoing learning. So I would love to hear from you if you have specific habits or practices or sources that you use to continue to grow professionally and, if you want, also personally.
I live in this like funny tension sometimes where I know like things I should do, and then I catch myself not doing them, and then I get mad at myself, like disaster spiral. But I think something that I personally find helpful every so often as an educator is to sometimes intentionally go out and learn something really new and to practice some of the things that I use as educational tools for others or instructional tools for others myself. So, for example, this is very esoteric, I apologize, but I'm like currently learning to become what's called a champagne specialist. And that's just because I was like, I'm going to go learn about something that I don't really know a whole lot about. That sort of seemed like it would be fun. And I was looking for something that had a very social kind of component to it. So I do try to practice these intentional moments of metacognition myself. I try to think about regulating my own learning. Like, was I paying attention in that class? What was bothering me? Why was I not? How will I change that for next time? If I come in next time after having also been tired and frustrated, what are some steps that I could take to adjust how I'm showing up? So I really try to interrogate that. And I think all this is just to say to you is I think it, in addition to being really good as being a lifelong learner, to have really good awareness of how you learn as a person, I also think it's really important to, from a human centered practice, sometimes to remember what it means to be a learner when you're an educator and notice to notice what's tricky, what's easy, what are things that you've instructional moves you've been doing for a long time that don't actually work, that do work, does that make sense? So it can be a good practice.
I think that's an excellent point about your own continued learning, that especially if you are someone who spends a lot of time educating others, to put yourself back in the shoes of those folks you're working with. It gives you that empathy, which you were talking about earlier, is such an important part of how we learn and our neuroplasticity piece. So we've covered a bit of ground in our time together today. So if you were to stress a point or 2 points or 3 points for listeners, what is it that you are hoping they take away from listening to our conversation?
Yeah, I think especially for folks who work within the learning businesses, I would be remembering that, like, what of the five principles, even though one of them is situated as, don't walk away from this as saying, oh well, we can't do that. Remember that you actually have a superpower in terms of your ability to control for the neurobiology, in terms of your ability to expansively frame, and in your ability to intentionally craft social relationships that actually is unique and really assetful as compared to learning that happens in corporate L&D or in the flow of work context. So please don't at all be disheartened. I just want to really underscore that. I think there are real assets to lean into. That would, I think, be one. And if I can have a second small one, that is also just to like recognize and cut yourself some slack right now, because learning right now and the world is in such a state of flux, and there's so much ambiguity in the business. There's tools that are coming up every day, and it feels like if you haven't read every single New York Times HBR article and tried the three new things that launched last week by 10 a.m., you're already behind. And that's not true. Like, the fundamental principles of how humans learn are the same with or without AI. And so just really hold on to the fact that you don't need to get caught in a rat race, and you're doing well.
That wraps up our conversation with Dr. Tessa Forshaw, the cognitive scientist directing the Workforce Learning and Innovation Initiative at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Stay with us for our recap.
You'll find show notes and a transcript for this episode at leadinglearning.com/episode 480, along with links to Tessa's profile on LinkedIn and where you can learn more about the initiative and the certificate program in workforce and workplace learning.
If you found this episode valuable, we'd be grateful if you'd share it. That helps more people benefit from the conversation, and it supports the work we do with the podcast.
Tessa opened our conversation by reframing what learning actually is. not content delivery, but a neurobiological process shaped by brain chemistry, hormones, and environment. And that shift in perspective is the foundation of 5 principles for designing effective learning experiences.
Those principles, that learning is biological, social, situated, and requires effort and must transfer, give learning designers a science-based lens for evaluating and improving their programs.
And she left us with a clear and actually quite easy to implement tip. Make intentional space for metacognition in your programs. The data, she says, is unambiguous. When learners have structured time to reflect on their own thinking and learning, then performance, durability, and transfer all improve.
Thanks again for listening. See you next time on the Leading Learning Podcast.